The doorbell rang just as Margaret Ellis was about to turn off the kitchen light, and the sound felt louder than it should have in her quiet house, a house that had learned silence over many years, a house that no longer expected surprises, and she paused with her hand on the switch, unsure why her chest felt tight, as if the evening itself had leaned closer to listen. Outside, the sky over her small Vermont street was painted in fading gold and blue, the kind of dusk that made memories drift in without asking permission, and for a brief second she considered not answering, telling herself it was probably a mistake or a neighbor, but something pushed her forward, something gentle yet firm, and she walked to the door, smoothing her cardigan without thinking, aware of her age in the way she often was these days, aware of the lines on her hands and the quiet strength in her posture, and when she opened the door, she found a young man standing on her porch, holding a small paper bag and wearing a delivery jacket that looked a little too thin for the cooling air, his hair slightly messy, his expression calm and respectful, not rushed like so many others she had seen over the years. "Good evening," he said, his voice steady and warm, and the sound of it surprised her because it carried no impatience, no boredom, just a simple kindness that made her blink once before answering, and when he said her name, Margaret Ellis, she felt a strange pull, as if hearing it spoken aloud by a stranger gave it new weight, and she nodded, confirming it was hers, stepping closer to take the bag, and in that brief moment when their fingers touched, nothing dramatic happened, nothing bold or improper, yet the contact lingered in her awareness longer than expected, like a soft echo, and she noticed how carefully he pulled his hand back, as if he understood the value of space, as if he respected it, and he smiled in a way that felt genuine, not forced, and introduced himself as Daniel, adding his name as if it mattered, as if this exchange was more than a transaction, and Margaret felt caught off guard by that small detail, because it had been a long time since someone new had offered their name with such intention. The air between them felt quiet but full, filled with the sound of distant traffic and the rustle of leaves, and for a second neither of them moved, and Margaret became aware of how long it had been since she had stood at her own front door talking to someone who wasn't a neighbor checking the mail or a salesperson reading from a script, and she realized she was studying his face without meaning to, noticing the calm focus in his eyes, the way he stood straight without trying to impress, and she wondered, briefly and without judgment, what his life looked like, where he came from, what stories he carried with him as he moved from door to door. Daniel glanced at the street, then back at her, as if aware of time but unwilling to rush the moment, and said he hoped she enjoyed her meal, not in a practiced way, but in a tone that felt personal, and Margaret thanked him, her voice softer than usual, and when he turned to leave, she felt an unexpected pull to say something more, anything to extend the moment, but the words didn't come, and she watched him walk down the steps, his figure blending into the evening light, and only after the door closed did she realize how still the house felt again, how the silence had returned but felt different now. As if it carried a question, she set the bag on the counter and leaned against it, taking a slow breath, trying to understand why her heart was beating faster, telling herself it was nothing, that she was reading too much into a simple delivery, yet as she unpacked her food, her thoughts kept drifting back to his voice, his calm presence, the way he had looked at her like a person and not a number on a screen, and she remembered how, years ago, she used to greet evenings with expectation. Waiting for her husband to come home, waiting for conversation, laughter, shared silence, and how after his passing, nights had become something to endure rather than welcome, and now, because of one unexpected knock at the door, something inside her had shifted, just slightly, like a window opening in a room that had been closed for too long. Margaret sat at the table but didn't eat right away, instead staring at the wall clock as it ticked steadily forward, feeling a mix of confusion and warmth, wondering why this moment mattered, why it stayed with her, and she told herself she would forget it by morning, that tomorrow would look just like every other day, but deep down she sensed that this evening had already placed itself gently in her memory, not as a beginning or an ending, but as a soft interruption, a reminder that even at 59, even in a quiet house at dusk, life could still reach out and knock, and when it did, it might leave behind more than just a paper bag on the counter. A week passed, and Margaret told herself she had already forgotten the young delivery man, yet when the doorbell rang again near the same hour, her body reacted before her thoughts, her heart lifting in a quiet, almost embarrassing way, and as she walked toward the door she realized she recognized the sound of the steps outside, light and unhurried, and when she opened it and saw Daniel standing there with another delivery bag, something settled inside her, not excitement exactly, but familiarity. And that feeling surprised her more than the first meeting had. He greeted her with the same calm respect, but this time his smile held recognition, and he said her name like he remembered it, not as something read from a screen, and Margaret noticed how natural it felt to answer him, how easily her shoulders relaxed, and when she joked that he must be getting tired of her address, he laughed softly and said he didn't mind at all, that some stops felt nicer than others, and she believed him because his eyes didn't wander and his voice didn't rush. Instead of handing over the bag and leaving, he asked how her evening was going, and the question didn't feel automatic, it felt sincere, and she found herself telling him she had been reading an old novel and watching the leaves fall from the maple tree in her yard, and Daniel listened, really listened, nodding, asking what the book was about, and the conversation moved quickly but smoothly, as if time bent around them, and Margaret became aware of how rare it was to speak without feeling like she had to explain herself or shorten her thoughts. Daniel mentioned that he worked long hours and often delivered to people who barely looked up, and he said it without complaint, just as a fact, and she sensed that he carried his own quiet loneliness, different from hers but real, and for a moment their lives touched in that shared understanding, and when he told her he liked delivering in the evenings because the world felt calmer, Margaret felt a gentle ache, remembering how evenings used to mean companionship to her, and now mostly meant reflection. When he handed her the bag, their hands brushed again, just briefly, and this time neither of them seemed surprised, but they both acknowledged it with a shared pause, a respectful awareness that made the moment feel meaningful without crossing any lines, and Daniel took a step back, as if to protect the balance between them, and said he hoped she had a peaceful night, adding that it was nice talking to her, and those simple words landed deeply, because they confirmed what she had been feeling, that this was more than a routine exchange. As he turned to leave, Daniel stopped and looked back at her, his expression thoughtful, and said, almost carefully, that she seemed like someone who had lived a full life, someone who carried stories in the way she spoke, and Margaret felt her breath catch, not because of flattery, but because no one had seen her that way in a long time, and she didn't know how to respond, so she simply thanked him, her voice soft but steady, and watched him walk away, feeling both warmed and unsettled by the honesty of the moment. After the door closed, Margaret stood in the hallway longer than necessary, replaying his words in her mind, feeling a mix of comfort and confusion, reminding herself of the years between them, the differences in their lives, and the boundaries that mattered, yet she couldn't deny the way his presence had lit something inside her that she thought had dimmed forever, and as she sat down to eat, she realized she was smiling without knowing why, and that realization made her pause, because it wasn't about romance or fantasy. It was about being noticed, about being spoken to with care, and that simple human connection filled a quiet space in her heart that she had learned to live with but never truly accepted. Later that night, as she prepared for bed, Margaret found herself listening for sounds outside, not expecting anything, but aware now that some moments could return, that life could repeat a kindness, and as she lay in the dark, she wondered if Daniel would come again, and if he did, whether this gentle thread between them would grow or quietly fade, and that unanswered question followed her into sleep, resting there like a soft, steady heartbeat, reminding her that something had begun to move, even if she did not yet know where it was leading. The evening Daniel came without a delivery felt different from the start, because Margaret sensed something unusual before the doorbell even rang, a quiet tension in the air that made her pause mid-step, and when she opened the door and saw him standing there with empty hands and a careful expression, her first thought was that something had gone wrong, but his calm presence quickly eased her worry as he greeted her softly and explained that he was on a short break and had hoped it would be all right to stop by for a moment, and Margaret hesitated only briefly before stepping aside, not inviting him in but allowing the conversation to happen on the porch where the cool air kept things clear and grounded. Daniel spoke quickly at first, as if afraid he might lose his courage, explaining that over the past weeks he had found himself thinking about their talks, about the way she listened and spoke with care, and Margaret felt her chest tighten, not with fear, but with the weight of being important to someone again, and she listened closely, watching his hands move slightly as he chose his words, noticing how seriously he treated the moment, how much effort he put into being respectful. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small envelope, holding it out with both hands like something fragile, and said he had written her a note, not to expect anything from it, not to change anything, but simply because some feelings felt wrong to keep silent, and Margaret accepted it slowly, her fingers trembling just enough for her to notice, and as she opened it and began to read, the world around them seemed to quiet, the street sounds fading into the background as his words filled her attention. Daniel wrote about his grandmother, a woman who had raised him with patience and strength, a woman who believed that kindness between strangers could be just as meaningful as love between partners, and he explained that Margaret reminded him of her, not in age but in spirit, in the way she carried herself with dignity and warmth, and as Margaret read on, tears gathered in her eyes, not because the note was dramatic, but because it was honest, and honesty had become rare in her life, and he thanked her for the way she spoke to him, for making him feel human during long days of rushed interactions, and for reminding him that small moments could still matter. When she finished reading, Margaret held the paper close to her chest, unable to speak right away, because the note had touched something deep and personal, something connected to years of quiet grief and self-reliance, and Daniel watched her carefully, ready to apologize if he had overstepped, and when he said he never wanted to make her uncomfortable, that he only wanted her to know she had made a difference, Margaret finally found her voice and told him that the note meant more to her than he could understand, that it had arrived at a time when she needed proof that she was still seen, and her words came out steady but emotional, and Daniel nodded, relieved, his shoulders relaxing as if he had been holding his breath. They stood there for a long moment, not awkwardly, but thoughtfully, both aware of the space between them and the meaning within it. And Margaret spoke then, choosing her words with care, telling him about her late husband, about the years of shared life and the silence that followed, explaining not as a confession but as context, as truth, and Daniel listened with the same attention he always had, never interrupting, never trying to fix anything, simply accepting her story as part of who she was. The conversation moved quickly yet deeply, touching on loss, hope, and the strange ways people can cross paths without expecting to change each other, and Margaret felt a gentle warmth grow in her chest, not desire, not fantasy, but a calm appreciation for the connection they shared, and she realized that what mattered most was not where this moment could lead, but what it already was, a reminder of her capacity to feel, to connect, to matter. Daniel eventually glanced at his watch, aware that time was passing, and said he should go, that he didn't want to take more than he was given, and Margaret nodded, understanding the importance of endings just as much as beginnings, and before he stepped away, she thanked him, not just for the note, but for his kindness, for his respect, and for the way he treated her like a whole person, and Daniel smiled, that same quiet smile, and said that meeting her had been one of the best parts of his job, and as he walked down the steps, Margaret felt a mix of gratitude and sadness, knowing that whatever this was, it was precious because it was brief and honest. After he left, she went inside and sat at her table, unfolding the note again and reading it slowly, letting each word settle, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel the heaviness of loneliness pressing in on her, but instead felt a calm acceptance, a sense that life had given her a gift without asking anything in return, and she placed the note carefully in a drawer, knowing she would keep it, not as a symbol of something unresolved, but as proof that even at this stage of her life, even after loss and quiet years, she was still capable of touching someone's heart. And that knowledge stayed with her as the night deepened, steady and reassuring, like a light left on in a room she had once believed would stay dark forever. The last time Daniel came, Margaret sensed it before he spoke, because there was a careful distance in his smile and a softness in his eyes that carried goodbye even before the words arrived. And when he told her he had been reassigned to a different delivery route starting the next week, she felt a quiet ache settle in her chest, not sharp or dramatic, but deep and steady, like the closing of a chapter she hadn't realized she was still reading, and she nodded as he explained it wasn't his choice, that work moved people around without asking how they felt, and she understood that truth well, having lived long enough to see how life often decided things on its own terms. They stood on the porch as the late afternoon light stretched across the street, and Daniel spoke about his plans, about saving for school and helping his family, and Margaret listened with pride that surprised her. Pride not as something personal or possessive, but as admiration for a young man who carried responsibility with quiet strength, and she told him she believed he would do well, that his kindness would take him further than he realized, and her words came easily because they were true. Daniel hesitated, then reached into his jacket and handed her the envelope again, saying she should keep it somewhere safe, and Margaret smiled gently, telling him she already had, and for a moment they shared a look that held everything they did not need to say, understanding that what mattered had already been exchanged, that no promises were required, no future imagined, because this connection had never been about crossing boundaries but about honoring a moment of shared humanity. Daniel thanked her for listening, for speaking to him like his thoughts mattered, and Margaret felt emotion rise but kept her voice steady as she thanked him in return, explaining that his presence had reminded her she was still part of the world, still capable of connection, and that was a gift she would carry forward, and he nodded, visibly moved, as if her words settled somewhere deep within him. When it was time to part, there was no hesitation, no lingering confusion, just a calm acceptance, and Daniel stepped back, giving her the space he had always respected, and wished her well with sincerity that felt complete, and Margaret watched him walk down the steps for the final time, noting the steady rhythm of his stride, the way he did not look back, trusting the ending enough to let it stand. And when the street grew quiet again, she closed the door slowly, not rushing to fill the silence, allowing it to exist without fear. Inside, the house felt different now, not empty, but settled, and Margaret moved through it with a sense of peace she had not felt in years, making tea, sitting by the window, watching the evening deepen, and she thought about how brief encounters could still leave lasting marks, how not every meaningful connection needed to turn into something more to be valuable. And she realized that what Daniel had given her was not romance in the traditional sense, but recognition, a reminder that her life still held worth beyond memory and routine. Days turned into weeks, and Margaret returned to her usual rhythm, yet something within her had shifted, her posture lighter, her thoughts less heavy, and she found herself more open to the world around her, smiling at neighbors, lingering in conversations, allowing herself to feel without guarding every emotion. And one afternoon she framed Daniel's note and placed it on her bookshelf, not as a symbol of longing, but as a quiet reminder of kindness received and shared. Sometimes, when the doorbell rang, she still felt a small lift of anticipation, but it no longer carried disappointment, only gratitude, because she understood now that life did not stop offering moments simply because one had grown older or known loss. And as winter gave way to spring, Margaret spent more time outside, tending her garden, letting the sun warm her face, feeling connected again to the passage of time instead of separate from it. She often reflected on how easily she might have dismissed that first knock at the door, how close she came to missing something meaningful simply because she assumed her story was finished, and this realization stayed with her, shaping the way she greeted each day, each small chance for connection. And though Daniel moved on to another route, another part of the city, his presence remained in the lesson he left behind, that dignity, kindness, and attention could bridge even the widest gaps, and that sometimes the most powerful gestures were not the ones that promised a future, but the ones that honored the present. Margaret carried that understanding with her, walking forward with quiet confidence, knowing she did not need to chase youth or regret the past, because her life, just as it was, still had room for warmth, meaning, and gentle surprise. And as she turned off the light each night, she did so not with resignation, but with calm acceptance, grateful for the moment when a simple knock on the door reminded her that the heart does not retire, it only waits, patiently, for a reason to open again.